Can implantation bleeding be heavy and last for several days, or is it usually light?
Hello everyone, and welcome to our video on implantation bleeding. Today, we'll be discussing an important question. Can implantation bleeding be heavy and last for several days, or is it usually light? Let's dive in and find out.
Understanding implantation bleeding.
Before we address the question at hand, let's first understand what implantation bleeding is. Implantation bleeding is a phenomenon that occurs when a fertilized egg attaches itself to the lining of the uterus. It typically happens around 6 to 12 days after conception, which is usually around the time of the expected menstrual period.
Characteristics of implantation bleeding.
Implantation bleeding is often described as light spotting or discharge that may be pink, brown, or even slightly red in color. It is generally much lighter than a regular menstrual flow and doesn't require the use of pads or tampons. Most women report only needing a panty liner to manage the bleeding during this time.
Unusual cases of implantation bleeding.
While implantation bleeding is typically light and short-lived, there are some cases where it can be heavier and last for several days. However, it's important to note that heavy bleeding and prolonged duration are not common characteristics of implantation bleeding. In such cases, it's crucial to consider other possible causes for the bleeding, such as hormonal imbalances, infections, or even miscarriage. If you experience heavy bleeding or have concerns, it's always best to consult with a healthcare professional for a proper evaluation.
Differentiating implantation bleeding from menstrual period.
Differentiating between implantation bleeding and a regular menstrual period can sometimes be challenging, as they can share similar characteristics. However, there are a few key differences to consider. Firstly, implantation bleeding usually occurs earlier than a typical period, often around a week before the expected menstruation. Secondly, implantation bleeding is generally lighter and shorter in duration compared to a regular period. Lastly, the color and consistency of the bleeding may also differ, with implantation bleeding often being lighter and more of a pink or brownish color. To sum up, while implantation bleeding is typically light and lasts for a short duration, there are rare cases where it can be heavier and persist for several days. However, it's important to be aware that heavy bleeding and prolonged duration are not typical characteristics of implantation bleeding. If you experience any concerns or have doubts about the nature of your bleeding, it's always best to reach out to a healthcare professional for guidance and a proper evaluation. Thank you for watching, and we hope this video has provided you with helpful information.